On May the 19th, Herbert W. Armstrong College president and Key of David presenter Stephen Flurry delivered a commencement address to the graduating class of 2019. The following program is adapted from his address.
The Trumpet Daily.
Greetings to everyone at both campuses, Herbert W. Armstrong College. Greetings to our Chancellor back in Edmond, all of the ministers and faculty present at both locations. Of course, the graduates, the alumni. We have lots of family, special guests, visitors, lots of distinguished guests. So this truly is a special ceremony that we're able to enjoy every year. And it's an honor to be a part of this, the 17th graduation ceremony at Armstrong College. This year, of course, we congratulate the class of 2019. That's exciting. Several years ago, there was a New York Times columnist who lamented the glaring deficiencies that he saw in higher education. He said, for example, that there are no college courses in proper mate selection, for one, and that they don't have courses on how to make and keep friends. So essentially what he was saying is that, well, you might go off to college and learn how to make a living. It doesn't really teach you how to live. Now, Herbert W. Armstrong, as we know, established God's college on the foundation of the Word of God, the Holy Bible. And the Bible, as Mr. Armstrong often said, it's like our Maker's instruction book, or the manual that he sends along with his creation. And we know, and we're taught at all of these classes at Armstrong College, maybe some more than other, but the foundation is there with all of them. We're taught how to live from our how-to manual. I thought it was interesting as I was just going over some of those statements from that column years ago, and thinking back to Principles of Living. I didn't teach that this year, but over the years I've taught it maybe 10 or 11 times. And I went back to the first set of notes, the course outline that we hand out, the very first paragraph that the freshmen, these are incoming freshmen, 18-year-olds, and this is Freshman Bible, together with Life and Teachings, I guess the other Bible class for freshmen. It's mandatory, everybody attends, and this is what it says. This is the course outline. It says, Principles of Living examines human sexuality, dating, and mate selection from a theological perspective. It says, this knowledge lays a firm foundation for the God-ordained marriage and family relationship. It says, in a broader sense, God's perspective is what's missing from knowledge in general. Therefore, in addition to laying the groundwork for the family relationship, Principles of Living will serve as a guide for the student's pursuit of true education, learning how to live. So this is one of the very first things that freshmen are taught coming into this college. This is really what you could say this is AC's specialty. We, of course, talk about the more general liberal arts education, but if there is one specialty training that you get at this college, it's in this foundation of how to live. Tonight, or today, I just want to remind you graduates, and really all of us, I want to remind us, and you heard it even from our president's, our student body president's address earlier, I just want to remind us that this commencement ceremony, it really is just a beginning. He brought out how it was a launch as well, and that's an exciting way to look at it, because we really are taking off. When you leave college, all of you, when you think about how to live, how to build a marriage and family, so all of our graduates, you're not yet married, you don't yet have a family, so there's a lot of work yet to be done. There's a lot of building yet to do. It's a privilege and honor to come to God's college and to receive such a solid foundation. And it is something so wonderful that we can build upon. But as I say, you're going to go away from college as a graduate knowing, hopefully, that there's so much more to build. If you think about it just for a moment, most of the things that you learn in life, if you look at your life from start to finish, most of what you learn over the course of that life is going to be learned outside of a classroom. Classroom instruction has its place, and it is important, and we do need it. And even in God's church, we come and assemble at services to receive instruction. But think about how much more we learn on the job or with practical hands-on experience. And then think about, of course, the spiritual dimension to all of this. Mr. Armstrong often said that salvation is education. And so it's a process. It's a process that never truly does end. It just continues right on into God's kingdom. And so education is something that we pursue after, not just while we're at college. It's a lifelong pursuit. It's a lifelong endeavor. True education. Salvation is education. Think about all the things that you're going to be doing, as I say, after graduation. Mr. Armstrong had that classic quote, remember, in the autobiography about education comes from this, from study, from experience, from travel, from thinking about what you see and experience. It comes from contacts, people that you meet. Obviously, it's going to come from your job experience. It's going to come from practical hands-on experience with marriage and family. And so the education, the training, it continues. Tonight I just want to, if I have enough time, hopefully I can get through three simple points. I know we don't usually take notes at graduation, but we'll probably have this posted at some point later if you'd like to go back and review these three simple points on going forward and commencing with your continuing education. It really is something that you should see as an assignment. Your assignment, if you choose to accept it, your assignment is to go on from here and to grow, as it says in 2 Peter 3:18, to grow in learning and understanding and wisdom, to build, as I say, to build for God. The first point, and this is brought out in an article my father wrote back in 2015, it's to become totally teachable before God. He wrote in that Trumpet magazine back in 2015 about the greatest lesson that Steve Jobs learned. Steve Jobs, of course, you're familiar with him and what he did with Apple. But in this little article, my father talks about a couple of biographies about Steve Jobs and how that, in the case of one biographer, he kind of divided his life into three acts. And it was in the second act that he had a lot of setbacks and failures. And my father brought out the point that in that second act of his life, he really became more humble and teachable. And that led to the greatest act or phase of his life, when he really took Apple to where we see it today. There's a verse in Isaiah 66 that talks about God looking to those who are humble and contrite, who tremble before God's word. This is the sort of attitude that we have to have if we're going to be able to be taught by God. Another verse I just went through recently for a program. This is Jeremiah 10 and verse 23, where the prophet says, "O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It's not in man that walks to direct his steps." So imagine going off to a college and learning that lesson, that it's not in man to direct his steps. We need help. We need help as a college student, and you need it as a graduate. You need it as an adult. You need it as an elderly individual in God's church. We need guidance and direction from God every day. Isaiah 55 talks about just how this vast difference between the thinking of God and then our thoughts. We have to appeal to God daily and go to him. That same passage in Jeremiah, by the way, it talks about praying for God to correct us, to correct our steps, to correct our ways, so that we can know the way to go. That's a valuable lesson, and hopefully you're beginning to learn that. You students, you've gone through this experience 2 and 4 years, and hopefully this really is beginning to sink in. This is one big takeaway from the college experience, that we don't know. We don't know the way, but God will show us. I won't take the time to go through more verses in Proverbs 3, But that section there speaks about how easy it is to just lean to your own understanding instead of in trusting God. It's natural. It comes natural to lean to your own understanding. You come to college, you get that outline for principles of living, and hopefully you come to understand right away that I'm here for God to show me, to help me see the way to go. It was brought out earlier tonight. Why the college is here, how much it's needed to support the work, why Mr. Armstrong established it back in 1947. That's a fundamental lesson if we're going to continue with our education beyond this commencement. The second point that I'll touch on briefly is to cultivate a spirit of curiosity. Mr. Armstrong, again, he's a good example with any of these lessons. But when you think about the way that he brings this out in the autobiography, just how much he craved understanding, and he would pester his dad and ask him how things worked, and he was always trying to understand why this happened or why this was going on. And his father teased him, saying that he thought he was going to be a Philadelphia lawyer because he was always asking so many questions. A lot of children do that, but we tend to lose that curiosity as we get older and we take things for granted, or we hear, a short answer from a parent or a guardian that just says, I don't know, it's just that way, forget about it. Instead of someone that takes the time to answer and to help us come to understand. Listen to what Mr. Armstrong said. He follows this story about when he was 5, he was asking all of these questions, and then he makes this point. The obsession for understanding was to have great influence on founding the Plain Truth magazine and Ambassador College in later years. So it just sprung from that same attitude or mindset that he had as a little kid, a little child. I wanted to know why. And then he says this obsession, think about it, an obsession to understand. That's what led to the creation of the Plain Truth. Ambassador College, his education never stopped. Mr. Armstrong, he continued right up to 93. He was writing Mystery of the Ages. Now that's someone that had a passionate obsession for knowledge and understanding and wisdom. What an example. And you think about Mystery of the Ages and all of those wonderful questions that are addressed in that book. My father's talked about who and what is God being the greatest question there is. But look at where it all started. It goes back to when he was just a little boy and he wanted to understand and know. And then when God started to work on his mind later in life, he took that same approach. He wanted to know. He wanted to understand. He was intensely curious about God's truth and God's way of life. This year's the 500-year anniversary of Leonardo da Vinci's death, and so there's lots of exhibits throughout the UK and in Europe, in France, at the Louvre, at Buckingham Palace later this month. And so they're putting a lot of Da Vinci's drawings and paintings on display. And it's been interesting just reading a little bit about his passion for learning. This is someone that didn't understand God's truth, but he really did have a curiosity, an intense curiosity. He didn't have the university education of his day. He did benefit from a few mentors. But outside of that, his remarkable education, and it really is, in a strictly worldly sense, his remarkable education, it just sprung from the fact that he was interested in just about everything. He had a passionate interest in things. He really wanted to learn. An insatiable hunger for knowledge. He had it. He had it. He saw himself, it's interesting, we all see him as a painter, but he saw himself more as an engineer or an architect. There's a funny point brought out in a book on him that when he was applying for a job, he was sending his resume or his job description, and he emphasized all of these points about architecture and an engineer, and he wanted to do this, that, and the other. And then at the end of his application, he says, "Oh, and by the way, I paint as well." It was words to that effect. So he was also a painter. And there's lots of scholars and historians that actually look at his life, and they're frustrated because he spent so much time in these other pursuits. But they think, well, if he just would have painted more, we'd have even more of his glorious paintings. But those other pursuits did factor in to his brilliance with the brush. There's this line in his notebooks, his journal, where he had a journal entry saying, it was like a to-do list, I guess. He said he wanted to describe the tongue of a woodpecker, which is kind of an interesting desire to have. But if you look at we've had articles in some of the church literature about a woodpecker and just the design of its beak and its skull and the tail and the way that it's able to latch on to the side of a hickory oak and then just start pounding away. I don't know, I think it pounds into an oak tree, for example, sometimes 100 pounds per minute. That's phenomenal. I don't know if you've ever tried to bash your head against a tree 100 times, but you would sustain some serious head trauma from that. But when you look at the way the beak is constructed and the skull and then the tissue, the sponge-like tissue that you have surrounding the brain, and then as is brought out in this Isaacson biography about Da Vinci, the tongue is the most fascinating member in this marvelous little creation of God. It's about 3 times the length of the beak, and of course the beak is sharp and long as well. And so it's like a hammer hammering away, drilling that hole, and then the tongue comes out 3 times as long, and it's kind of a sticky substance that goes right down to where these grub worms are, or ants or whatever. Ants mistake it for being a worm, an intruder, so they basically rush the worm, and then they land on this sticky tongue, and it's just easy pickings for this woodpecker. But the most fascinating thing about it is that when the tongue is pulled back inside of the beak, it doesn't fit in there because it's so long. It actually wraps around the brain to serve as more cushion. It's like it's a helmet. It serves as a helmet for the woodpecker, and it's also its weapon to get all of those ants. And this is something, as I was reading through that, you think of Romans 1 and verse 20, and how that the creation, God's creation, it proves his existence. It proves his power, his creativity. Forget about Da Vinci's creativity for a moment, but think of the creativity of God himself, the great creator God. All the things that we can see, the material things that make the invisible real and obvious. It's so obvious that nothing like that could have just evolved over the course of millions and millions of years. How bizarre it would be to think that you could somehow go from, a nice little bird who's not a woodpecker to then a woodpecker, and it somehow evolved or transitioned over time. But going back to Da Vinci, Mr. Armstrong, some of these examples, my father wrote this, or said this in those meditation tapes years ago. He said, great minds seem to all have one common trait among them. They seem to have an interest in everything, and not only just a passing interest, but an intense interest in just about everything. He says, I think that's a common trait of all great men or great minds. They have this intense curiosity. Someone said about Da Vinci that he surely was the most curious human being in history. The way that in his notebooks, I think, bring this out. But it's important for us to maintain that curiosity and to have that hunger for learning. The Bible talks about hungering for God's truth, God's righteousness. My father's gone through Jeremiah 1, and that section where it says to Jeremiah, it's back and forth between him and God says to him, Jeremiah, what do you see? What are you observing? And he had to be detailed, and he was detailed. Read Jeremiah 1. So he was observant to these visions that God was giving to him. There's a lot to be gleaned from being curious, observing God's creation, just observing events around us. being observant to what's happening in God's work with respect to the creation. I mentioned Romans 1:20, but Psalm 19 talks about the heavens declaring the glory of God. So much can be learned from that. One final point to make, and this springs from Matthew 5 and verse 48, a memory verse, the one that says, "Become you therefore perfect, even as your Father, which is in heaven, is perfect." Matthew 5 and verse 48. And the third point I'll leave you with is to aim for perfection. As you go forward, you're certainly not there yet. None of us are. But that is where we're headed. God is reproducing himself. God is reproducing his character and his nature. And so we have to aim high. My father said years ago that there are no accidental masterpieces. It doesn't just happen. We don't stumble upon a masterpiece. The masterpiece is made by a lot of detailed, diligent labor and effort. I mentioned the other night with our book club that when Da Vinci set out to work on his masterpiece, the Mona Lisa, he started that in 1503 and he continued it on and off for the next 14 years. He basically had 3 paintings that he just kept with him for the last 15, 16 years of his life. These were his babies. These were the paintings that he cherished. One of them was Lisa, the Mona Lisa. And if you look at that painting, it's really mesmerizing. And you can see a lifetime of intense curiosity and interest in a lot of different subjects that come out as a result of that painting, or you see it rather in that painting. National Geographic had an article in 2017 that said the Mona Lisa's smile is the culmination of a lifetime spent studying art, science, optics, and every other possible field that he could apply his curiosity to, including understanding the universe and how we fit into it. Well, he didn't quite understand our purpose for being, but he loved nature. And you look at the background of the Mona Lisa, or you look at the way that she's smiling, or you look at her eyes, you look at the lighting. He studied all of those things. He dissected 30 human bodies over the course of his life. When he got a job to sculpt a horse, he immediately set out to go dissect a horse, because he had to know how the muscles, how the tendons, how everything was underneath the skin. He had to know what was going on outside and inside. That's some kind of detail. To be on someone's deathbed waiting for him to die so that you could begin cutting him open. That's how, and then you look at his notebooks and the drawings of all of these muscles and bones, and this was back in the 1500s, even earlier than that. That's someone who's really curious about a lot of things. In Walter Isaacson's biography, he said, what about all the scholars and critics over the years who despaired that Leonardo squandered too much time immersed in studying optics and anatomy and the patterns of the cosmos? He says, the Mona Lisa answers them with a smile. It all factored in. It all contributed to his masterpiece. God is producing masterpieces of his own. He's reproducing himself, as I said earlier. I want to leave you with a quote. This is from Mystery of the Ages. To just think about this and put it on the spiritual plane. The fact that God's, of course, we have to be willing. It's God doing the creation, but we have to be willing. We have to let him create. We have to let him shape us and mold us into a perfect God being. He says here, this is Mystery of the Ages, human life is at once of infinitesimally less value than they suppose, the scholars, he says, and at the same time of supremely greater potential than they know. You don't learn this in the colleges and universities of today. You go to those universities and they tell you how great human beings are. If they only knew, Mr. Armstrong says, it's of less value than they suppose, but it's the potential that we need to be focusing on. What God is creating He says, what is the real truth concerning human worth? What is the real value of a human life? He says it's grossly overestimated in its own reality and astoundingly undervalued in its supreme potential. The truth is indeed staggering. If we'll submit to God's will, going back to that first point, and really let Him guide and direct our steps, think about where it's taking us. Think about where this is leading. We want to keep that big picture in mind as we go on from this launch. And as we do also, just think about how much God's work needs our students, our graduates, our young people, our young couples, our young families. Think about how much the work needs your youth, your energy, your curiosity, your enthusiasm, your excitement for God's way of life. It's very important. It's a wonderful blessing to receive what you've received here at college for these 2 or 4 years. But now, as your student body president told you earlier, now the true test is upon you.